Hello, I'm Matt Damour of the Link newspaper and 99% Media. Now, if you had told me last spring that myself and a group of independent journalists would someday sit down with senior members of the Montreal Police Service to discuss the treatment of independent journalists in Montreal, I probably would not have believed you. Last spring, there was a flurry of protest activity downtown in Montreal, and we saw a lot of situations where independent, alternative, and student media members were being denied access, intimidated, or sometimes outright assaulted by members of the Montreal Police, specifically riot police, while covering protests. However, that's exactly what happened. On Monday, September 21st, myself and members of the independent press in Montreal sat down with Commander Ian Lafrenière, who's in charge of communications at the Montreal Police Department, to discuss the treatment of independent journalists. This was part of a long-term project that we were developing where we were documenting some of the instances where independent journalists were mistreated by the police. And part of this project was actually to try and start a conversation with the SPVM, the Montreal Police Service, to try and address some of these issues. It took a while, but we eventually got some allies in this particular project, specifically Tom Hennifer, who's the executive director of an organization called Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. So once we actually got into the meeting, we didn't know what to expect. There was a concern that we were going to have to spend a lot of the time of our hour-long meeting just trying to justify the premise, which was that there was a problem in the way that Montreal Police were treating independent journalists. But what surprised us right off the bat is that we didn't have to argue this point. There was an admission and an acknowledgement from Commander Lafrenière that the relationship between independent press and the police has not been the best. And as far as Ian Lafrenière was concerned, and what he said in the meeting, is that that discrimination should not be happening. He said that personally he doesn't make that distinction between quote-unquote mainstream journalists and independent journalists, which is all good and well to say, and we'll see if we can actually get some movement to turn that into a practical reality on the ground. Lafrenière was actually quite candid in saying, look, it's a difficult reality to contend with because you have situations where everybody can have a blog or everybody can have a smartphone and they could just raise their hands and say that, yes, I'm a member of the press, and sometimes you do have quote-unquote protesters with cameras, which does present some interesting philosophical and ideological issues because journalists should not be at these kinds of events to participate or to protest. They're there to cover things. And when it comes to student media, sometimes you'll have a lot of different students who will show up maybe for a class assignment, and he said himself, sometimes you'll have 50 or more student journalists who show up, and it isn't practical to give everybody the same level of access. There's a larger conversation to be had there, certainly, and it's not something that's going to be dealt with overnight. None of these issues are going to be dealt with overnight, but at least we've gotten the conversation going. In terms of how we're going to be proceeding, we did come to an understanding during the meeting that we now have a point of contact in Commander Lafrenière, where if we have concerns over a particular event in the future, we can get in touch with him to try and discuss it. And we do have the possibility of a lot of protests coming up this fall in Montreal, specifically strike action and anti-austerity movements, so it's good that we have that line of contact. In addition, we did sort of point out that sometimes it can be a little bit ambiguous and unspecific. What exactly are the expectations of Montreal Police when it comes to the conduct of journalists? And in response to this issue that we raised, Commander Lafrenière said that he's going to be emailing the group of independent journalists who was in that meeting a list of quote-unquote ground rules, sort of a code of conduct that the Montreal Police Department expects from journalists in these situations. It's not going to be specific to the point of you have to be X number of feet away from an arrest as it's taking place, because these situations differ, but at least sort of general ground rules that we can look at, and we've also been invited to read it over and provide feedback. After the meeting, we did have a press conference outside of the Montreal Police Department. It was myself, Tom Hennifer from the CJFE, and Simon Van Vliet from the Quebec Association of Independent Journalists. Tom Hennifer took the lead and sort of talked about what happened in the meeting and the feelings he had about how his organization is going to be involved in this process and what came out of the meeting.
The past has seen far too much aggression and violence meted out on the press. Too many good reporters have been hurt or arrested. Today, we took a major step forward in ensuring the safety of reporters and the independent press exercising their constitutional rights on the ground in Montreal.
And in addition, I spoke about about the interest of student journalists at these protests and hopefully what will come out of these discussions with the SPVM.
The main hope that I have is that I will no longer have conversations with some of my student journalist colleagues who tell me that they no longer want to go out and cover a protest because they are afraid. Because they're afraid of how they're going to be treated by the police. And again, we're not saying that every police officer is guilty of this, but there have been too many situations where people have been either denied access or outright assaulted by police for simply trying to cover a protest.
Ultimately, I think that this is a good first step. The best thing that can come out of these conversations is a state of affairs where journalists are able to do their jobs without interference from police. It's not in the interests of either journalists or the public that they're trying to inform to have an adversarial relationship with the police. I'm not going to go as far as to say that we should be working together, but there should be a common understanding of what one expects from the other in both parties trying to do their jobs. So, like I said, it's a good first step. Hopefully there will be a continuation of conversation where we come up with, a common understanding of how things should be proceeding. What comes next? There are more protests coming up in Montreal. Lafrenière was very adamant, though, that it's not going to change overnight and bad things will happen between now and the next meeting. That's not something that he can change right away. It's a long-term project, but hopefully we've taken the right first step. And I look forward to updating you on future conversations and hopefully positive developments that come out of this.